regardless of what your political perspective is, I think we can all agree that the federal government has begun recently, but even more, I would say, over the last several decades, to move further out of economic development. So I really commend the idea of philanthropy taking steps to shore up local competitiveness in this region and around the country. So what I thought I would do today is first talk about what innovation districts are from the Brookings perspective, why we think they've emerged as the new geography of innovation, talk a little bit about what different models look like around the country, and then get under the hood on what strategies are at play to really make these things work. And through all of this, talk a little bit about who the actors are around the country doing this type of stuff. So let's begin with what innovation districts are and why they now matter. So we need to take a step back and talk about what the geography of innovation looked like in this country over the last century or so. So during the Industrial Revolution, what we really had were innovation districts that were manufacturing hubs in major areas of cities. They were pretty much all the pejoratives that you can think of. They were dark, they were dirty, they were dangerous. But they did concentrate economic activity within cities and the regions that surround cities. However, in the decades that followed World War II, what we really saw was an expansion far into the exurbs and suburbs of cities around research parks. The idea here was that major companies were essentially carving out new markets. And what was the coin of the realm was not collaboration and interaction, it was really trade secrets. And so getting behind the fence and developing products in isolation. So workers would drive to a remote research park, work for the day, and then leave. However, in the last decade, we've seen an emergence of a new geography of innovation, what we call innovation districts. Innovation districts are in the dense hubs of downtowns and midtowns, and then also in other areas around the country that really mix amenities, not just where people work, but live and play. And these aren't things that have been crafted from public policy. Market dynamics have really dictated the emergence of innovation districts. So in the 1950s to 1980s, about a little over half of families were the traditional family, where you'd have two parents and children, usually one breadwinner. This has changed to less than 1/3 of families now look that way. We now, with the baby boomer generation growing and with millennials, people are the common family, the number one thing that families are now looking for is how close they are to where they want to work, live, and play. So this is fundamentally shifting the way companies are thinking about how they attract workers. And we see this playing out all over the country. So GE had its headquarters in Fairfield, Connecticut for about 50 years. And here in the last, I think 2 years ago, they relocated the Boston Seaport. Why did they do it? Because this is what talented workers now need. The top occupation in demand at GE now is a software developer. And people are demanding to live in these places where they actually want to work, live, and play. So we are seeing not only just companies changing the way that they think about innovation in terms of a collaboration and coordination, we're fundamentally seeing them shift to where workers want to be. So we're the Brookings Institution. Everything has to have a definition. So this is how we define innovation districts: geographic areas where anchor institutions and companies cluster, connect with small firms, startups, business incubators, and accelerators. They're physically compact, transit accessible, usually have high-speed broadband, and what's really important is that it's mixed use: housing, retail, and office. This is really the fundamental difference between how we innovated 30 years ago and what we do today. And one of the really fantastic things about innovation districts today versus how we thought about research parks 30 years ago is now, because they're right in the middle of where people live, of different people of different backgrounds and skill levels, that there's a huge demand for connecting with local communities. So where we see in the districts we're working around the country, we see huge opportunities for people without college degrees. This is particularly true in medical-centered districts, but also in districts around the country that have different anchors. So I thought what I would do to give you sort of a flavor of what we think innovation districts are looking like around the country is I thought I'd give you 5 or 6 examples quickly and then march through some of these strategies of why they're working well. So you've got sort of a quintessential innovation districts in Midtown Atlanta clustered around Georgia Tech. They've got more corporate research centers have relocated to Midtown Atlanta because of some of the things that Georgia Tech has been doing than anywhere else in the country in the last 3 or 4 years. It's highly walkable, it's a dense neighborhood, and it's got a university anchor that's a strong partner with businesses. Although you also see these around major transit hubs. So this is Drexel University. It's about a 3-minute walk from 30th Street Station, the major Amtrak corridor for the Northeast Corridor. Within about 2/3 of a mile, you can walk around just shy of $2 trillion in federal R&D research, and more than double that in private sector research. So again, dense neighborhoods in the downtowns is one model, but it's not the only model. This is Oklahoma City, where we're doing some work, where you actually have a research-intensive medical district that's like many cities in this country. During urban renewal, a highway sort of split the city in half. And so you've got the amenity-rich neighborhood to the north of the medical district, and though it's only a 1/4 mile walk, it feels like 5 or 6 miles because it's just nothing in between the two. So one of the things that we think about when we build these innovation districts and help communities is how do you connect your research anchors, your corporate partners with these areas where people actually want to be. But you also see innovation districts come to fruition in smaller areas. So this is Chattanooga. So Chattanooga has the highest broadband speed in the country, and it's due to a public utility. And what they've now leveraged with this high-speed broadband is they're now attracting startups that need gigabit internet speed to do software development. They formed a partnership to do a mapping of different climate change in the area with Oak Ridge National Lab. It's a $1.3 billion lab that's kind of stranded in the middle of Tennessee. And so they formed this partnership around the public utility. And this is a good example of just taking an asset that you have. They don't have a dense downtown. They don't have sort of a traditional innovation district, but they built something out of their public utility that really works. And then you also see this in areas that perhaps unexpected. So in Detroit, obviously hard economic times over the last 2 decades in Detroit, they've really emerged as a placemaking hub where they've taken down a number of vacants and made them into incubator spaces and accelerators that are now actually attracting young talent in a city that's been losing population for the better part of a century. And this is just another example where, so this is Philadelphia, this is obviously Pike's Place in Seattle, and Station North in Baltimore. It's an arts district. So I just want to really hit home that this isn't about necessarily having a massive university. It's about finding public spaces and maximizing their use to attract talent, to make them hubs of entrepreneurship and creativity. What does this actually look like? What are actors doing around the country to motivate these types of changes in their districts? So the first and foremost thing is leadership. Now this seems obvious, but it really is the glue that brings these communities together. Chattanooga is probably one of my favorite examples. Chattanooga knows how to tell a story. Everybody in Chattanooga is talking on the same page. You can say, I brought my boss to Chattanooga and we told them that we were going to be there in about 48 hours ahead of time, and they had 25 of the probably most influential people in the city all got together at the last minute. They made it work. The mayor was there. They showed us around the town. Everyone was marching to the beat of the same drum, and they were really telling the story about how Chattanooga is a place that gets along, it coordinates, and they get things done. Boston, different story. This is just, tour de force. The mayor just made the Boston Seaport Innovation District himself. So different leadership models, coordination, just a strong leader, but really a fundamental element of all this. Another thing that I think astounds me that not enough communities are doing is really auditing their assets. Do they know what they're good at? So, for example, in Louisville, they're actually taking stock of all the public assets. It's amazing. Most cities don't know what they own. They have no idea, and if they know what they own, they only know the book value. They don't actually know the market value, so they can't leverage any of their assets. And I think plan big. I think really major strategies emerge from big thinking. So in Phoenix, Arizona, they moved the entire University of Arizona Medical School to the downtown. This was a 10-year process, a multi-billion-dollar effort, but it has fundamentally reshaped the innovation district in Phoenix, Arizona. Buenos Aires, they did the same thing, moved a major medical center into the heart of the city. But again, these are massive plays that take a long time to do, but they really can move the needle. And then I think another thing that cities are doing and their metropolitan areas is not just innovation. It's innovation that then scaled and is tested. So Pittsburgh is, the mayor of Pittsburgh has basically said that Pittsburgh will be the test bed for autonomous vehicles. And so he's plowed out all of the red tape. He's made the city, put different lanes on the roads, different actions from the city level to really not just make this something that's happening at Carnegie Mellon inside their science and technology centers, but actually on the roads. And so what this means is now they can start thinking about manufacturing. They can start thinking about how to train workers for the changing dynamics of the workforce with autonomous vehicles. So they can now make this an economic strategy for the entire city. And then finally, again, really focusing on entrepreneurship is key. This is something that all communities should be doing more of. The notion that entrepreneurship only exists on the coasts is absolutely insane. In almost any community that we look at, if you look at the fastest growing employment generators in the city, they're usually companies that are under 5 years old. So this is a major important element of this. So in Philadelphia, they're doing just a number of things. The city is partnering with universities on venture funds. So there's a $10 million fund at Drexel University. The city itself put up I think $1.5 million to help incubate small companies in the city and then ask them to stay. I think their requirement is for the grant is you need to stay for 6 to 9 months. They've got a great retention rate. San Francisco, I really like this example out of the mayor's office. They actually said, what we need is entrepreneurs that are working better with the city government. And so they started the first incubator in the country that's focused on young companies helping the government actually improve its business processes. And then linking this to the communities and linking this to workers at all different skills levels is absolutely essential. Innovation districts are not for those with PhDs in computer science. That's not what this is about. This is economic development for the entire city. So in Baltimore, you have University of Maryland's Biosciences Park, and in the middle of it, you have the University of Baltimore Community College. And so essentially, you can get a 2 years associate's degree in medical technologies or health transcription, and then get a job working for one of the companies in the biopark. It's an amazing model. Oh, I skipped ahead. But then also, I think another essential element of this is placemaking, is really focusing on making quality places that people actually want to be. So in Indianapolis, they have 16 Tech, which is a major build-out around their innovation district. And in Los Angeles, they have a number of different incubator spaces that are drawing in new communities to the heart of the downtown. Through all this, I really want to emphasize that these are not government programs usually how they're playing out. The mayors are a big part of this, but they're not they're not usually the only seat at the table. They're never the only seat at the table, and often they're not driving a lot of this action. In most of the places where we're working, we see philanthropy and other forms of the public sector and civic sector really driving this. So Innovation Works is an incubator and accelerator in Pittsburgh. It's probably done more to move the needle in terms of young startups in the city than any accelerator I've seen in the country. And it's a huge portion of its budget comes from local philanthropies. These are organizations that fundamentally understand that they have to, in order to build a community that they want, they need to have economic development based on the new economy. So whereas philanthropy in a number of cities once focused only on the arts and other types of community activities, now we're really seeing a sea change where philanthropy is focused on innovation at its core, usually around entrepreneurship, connecting companies and universities and young workers. Campus Martius is it's the placemaking effort in downtown Detroit. It's fundamentally shifted the downtown, which was essentially just blight for 30 or 40 years. And now that there's actual new movement down there, young companies developing. The Kresge Foundation was a huge element of this. And then finally, a third model in Philadelphia, University City District, is the Business Improvement District. And they have done a wonderful job at connecting anchor institutions with disadvantaged workers. They've got a training program where essentially all the major anchors, universities and corporate partners file through, they post job applications, and then this organization trains people from the community to actually work at the anchor institutions. And so the bottom line is, across the board, these are generally where we see success in innovation districts. It's driven largely not by the public sector. It's driven by the civic and private sector. And so, so I'm going to turn it over to Rachael now to hear a little bit more about what's going on the ground. But thank you all again. I really appreciate it.
So my name's Rachael, and this is a practitioner's perspective of the very early stages of an innovation district. Obviously, there isn't one here that I can point to for you. So my journey here, you may notice the accent gives me away a little bit, to Northern Virginia and to innovation is one of serendipity, technology, and Twitter, and we'll get to the Twitter later. My career started in finance and small business. I'm a meditation teacher, believe it or not. Founded charities, and then I tripped, stumbled, and fell into innovation here in Northern Virginia. I was born and bred in Sydney, Australia, and not a whole lot of movies made around Northern Virginia that we see down under. So Northern Virginia didn't pierce the bubble of sunshine and throwing shrimps on the Barbie until my charity was drowning in paperwork. So we had so much paperwork that we thought we might have to close our doors. Dandelion Support Network was mentioned in my introduction. It's a teeny tiny award-winning charity in Sydney, Australia, and we take the baby accoutrements that you don't need past the first couple of years, cribs, strollers, car seats. We refurbish them and insure them, and then through social workers pass them on to the have-nots from the haves, and in the process, we allow them to skirt past landfill. But the problem in a nanny state like Australia is that there's a lot of paperwork if you're going to insure an item that's going to go anywhere near an infant. And so it was taking us longer to do the paperwork than it was to serve our mission. And we faced, we're in a philanthropy organization here, a very common problem. We were choosing between the administration to keep our doors open or the mission that we were founded to solve. So I jumped on Guru Google in the wee hours of the morning one day, and I stumbled on the Twitter profile of a then very small Northern Virginia technology company that looked like they might just be able to solve my problem. So I internet stalked with the best of them, and I found the email address of the CEO, who happens to be with us this morning. I sent a Hail Mary email at the wee hours and asked for the software for free. So I am very lucky that they had a philanthropic program in place even when they were less than 20 people. The organization donated the software to my teeny tiny organization, as they do to organizations all around the world. There are some in South Africa, Kenya, Nepal, and a number that you may recognize. Washington West Film Festival, the Children's Science Center, and Cornerstones. So that software is still in use in my organization today as well. So fast forward a few years, and the relationship that we built working with the nonprofit and the tech sector spawned what is now Refraction. And some photos of some of our more recent events after our refit. And so what we are intending to do is to create an anchor in Reston for technology and innovation. We intentionally weave in nonprofits, specifically because when you have tech people talking to tech people about tech stuff every day, you tend to get tech that the rest of us have no idea what to do with. So we make sure that there's a culture of empathy and a culture that weaves the community into the very design of the companies that design the software and the products that exit it. So we have an intentional community here, and in order to do it justice, I dove into the research. So I researched everything I could get my hands on, from culture to innovation to collaboration to how to foster them, to environmental psychology and placemaking and interior design. How do I make a space that people want to innovate and collaborate in? Then I got to placemaking and economic development, and I got to Brookings and some of their information about innovation districts. And the more I read about innovation districts, the more I recognized in the world around me, not just here, looks like Sydney and a bunch of other places I know too, the slow death of the Greenfield Business Park. Like, everybody is attempting to shorten a commute, of millennials entering the workforce and the new values that they're bringing with them. Hi, my name's Rachael, I'm a millennial. There's so much changing happening right now, and we can see it when someone points it out to us, but it's almost like boiling a frog or a slap upside the head when we notice the changes that are going on. So I dug in, and I recognized this place, not just any place, this place in the research. I recognized some spaces that had been built a long, long time ago, well ahead of their time, that are designed expressly for this point in history. Thank you, Robert E. Simon. I found Reston. I found a place that is walkable, bikeable, green, livable. It's high density, it's mixed use. We have the likes of Google and AWS and Microsoft, Bechtel, Leidos. We have, I think we had a small part in it, but we have a raft of small technology companies now. We have community organizations that are already engaged, that care about innovation. We had what I thought was pretty much the perfect formula for making an innovation district. And I was absolutely certain that I wasn't the one to do it, but I was sure I knew a bunch of people who could. So I made a few phone calls and shot out a few emails, and I gathered together the most influential people locally who cared about the community and the future economic development of this area. And I sat around a table and I stole liberally from Brookings research, including that little Venn diagram I showed before, and I shared with them what I had learned. And that group, this group, which includes the Fairfax County EDA, both Virginia Tech and George Mason, Fosterly and Nova Labs, which are community organizations that support innovators and makers, the Greater Reston Chamber of Commerce, the Community Foundation, of course, and Refraction. So that group covers business, entrepreneurs, and makers. It covers philanthropy and the private sector. It covers as many angles as we could at the time, and it is wildly insufficient to represent the breadth and depth of the ecosystem. And so there are questions moving forward about how we broaden that, but for now, and not just because a significant portion of them are in the room, it is an incredible blessing to sit at this table, and we actually have a meeting later this afternoon. The acumen and the dedication to this area and to the future of it is astounding, and it's quite a gift to get to join them on a regular basis. So what we had accidentally done is step one of what Brookings says is necessary to build an innovation district, which is to build a collaborative network of leaders. And so what we're doing later this afternoon, as coincidence would have it, is attempting step two, which is, now that we've got to this point, what do we do next? Where is our vision for growth? But what we did first is something I'm actually quite proud of. I'm a culture junkie. So I care about the how of what we do, not just the what or the why of what we do. And this group of collaborators, it's not rare to have a group of institutions collaborating together. It's pretty stock standard, but it's what my college professors called fraught with risk. Having individuals with their own agendas representing institutions with their agendas, as closely aligned as they may be, it can sometimes be a struggle to align it to the greater agenda. And what we did was we got to know each other, we got to know the work each other is already doing, and we supported that. We figured out the authentic fit for us as individuals and for our organizations and institutions with the larger picture. And then we solidified and crystallized our first steps. And I'm infinitely proud of that culture. It is now a group that collaborates selflessly, and it is a leaderless group of peers. I have my own thoughts and feelings about how long that will last, because I think maybe our future necessitates something different. But for now, I'm very thankful that that's the way that we began. Once we formed and stormed, we then figured out what we wanted to say, kinda. And so we led salons, and we hosted world premieres, and we helped start what was the first census of its kind of the innovation ecosystem in this region. And that's trending towards creating an audit of some kind to help us figure out exactly what levers we need to pull and to make this work long term. Had we known what we were doing when we first started out, we may have hesitated. I was just gathering stakeholders around a table. But what we were really doing was trying to find the end of the ball of string of a wicked problem. And for those of you unfamiliar with wicked problems, they're wicked. They're also unsolvable. Now, they're unsolvable for 4 reasons. One, we can't get consensus. With problems as big as how do we change economic development or culture in anything, every perspective, every stakeholder defines the problem and the solution a different way. Additionally, data is either incomplete, non-existent, out of date, convoluted, hard to unpack. Usually wicked problems are connected with a bunch of other problems. You cannot separate economic development from philanthropy, from workforce development, from poverty, from a range of things. And the economic burden to solve it, if you do perchance figure it out, is at the very least intimidating and at the very worst insurmountable. So good on us. There are a million questions that we need to address in order to succeed and move forward with this particular wicked problem of an innovation district in Reston or anywhere in Northern Virginia. And there are 3 in particular that are really important to me. And the first one is, how do we broaden the group? How do we broaden our scope to better represent the Washington, D.C. metro? You may have noticed there was a very heavy Fairfax leaning in the logos I showed you before. How do we do that in a way that doesn't lose our potency, doesn't lose our relevancy, and doesn't lose our culture? How do we, secondly, change the strategy of an area economically? It's doing pretty okay. And how do we change the culture from one that has been deeply impacted by how ingrained we are with the military and government in this area that is siloed and hierarchical? How do we change that to the open systems that are necessary in order to collaborate and to support innovation? So the last 2 questions in particular I'd like to dive into a little bit, because the first one about broadening the group I'm sure is on the agenda this afternoon. So how do we take an abundant area like Northern Virginia, like the Washington, D.C. metro, and convince it that we need to shift? We aren't Cleveland or Detroit. We aren't on the ropes. We're not rebuilding from scratch. We're doing something fundamentally terrifying. We're changing what's worked. And that act of disruption is very scary and also completely necessary, or very soon the forces of change will put us on those ropes and make us build from scratch. It's something that is uncomfortable for us to wrap our arms around. It's something we must also force ourselves, demand of ourselves, to tackle. And while we're disrupting, we need to not just disrupt our strategy around economic development, but our culture. As I mentioned, this area does more government work or government technology work than anywhere else in the country. To the core of what has made us work for generations is our relationship with government. And government needs to be siloed and hierarchical. There is a necessity for that. And that's the antonym of what we need if we're going to be innovative. For even the private groups that work with the government, there are titles and business cards to match the pips on the shoulders of the government personnel that they work with in order for work to get done. So even some of our technology sector is as hierarchical as the government and the military that it serves. And similarly, failure in this region, we're not so much a fan. Our palate for failure is not so great. We don't tolerate it especially well. And I, for one, believe that too has to do with the depth and breadth of government and military, international aid, for example, that are cornerstones of this region and have been for a long time. You see, in those industries, failure means at the very least suffering or at the very worst loss of life. So the failure that is oxygen to innovation, failure, innovate, fail, better, fail again, fail better again, innovate, that process can't happen in an area that sees failure as a black mark or something that must be avoided at all costs. But, there is a but. I don't believe that that culture is insurmountable because I've spent a lot of time unpacking what innovation is, and I think we've got what it takes. Innovation is this. Innovation is engaged people, experts, people who care, people who want to build something, people who have an idea, who are collaborating with other engaged people, but who have a different perspective, a different industry, a different insight, a different cultural background, a different socioeconomic background. Some dissonance is necessary for those engaged people to collaborate over, and then we get something new. It's the intersection of different groups of knowledge or industries that breeds innovation. We have different industries, and we have the engaged people in spades, and the collaboration, we can work on that, and we are. We're creating meaningful ways for that collaboration to happen. So as a culture geek, the culture of innovation is something we can put together. It's something I think this region was built for. So, whilst I am deeply, deeply engaged in innovation, and I believe it's something that will drive my career till I eventually stop working, it's something that I think will change and morph over time. It's something that I can't get a handle on. The people who are working on exponential technology, the technology that's terraforming our future, the people who are figuring out how we can 3D print organs and how we can mine gold from old tech, the people who are figuring out how we can 3D print in space, because what? Those people don't know what the world looks like in 20 to 30 years. They have no idea, and there's no way we can keep up with that. So sometimes, instead of looking forward, I kind of look down a little bit. We look to our high schoolers. We look to those who are actually going to be shaping and living it. And we had Chantilly High entrepreneurship class do a tour of Refraction and ask us some questions about innovation and entrepreneurship last week. We have a framed picture of the album on the wall in Refraction. That's a long story, but grab me after if you want to hear it. And I offered a soda to anybody that could tell me what was in that frame, and I kept my soda. I asked the students as well how many of them intended to commute to work when they graduated. Not a single hand went up. When I asked them about data entry and staying with the same company, not a single hand went up. You see, for the people that are building this economy, or this new economy is being built for, the business park is just as unrecognizable as Pink Floyd. Sorry. So, back to what I do know for sure. What we know for sure is that come 2055, up to 50% of the processes and the things we do at work will be automated. And that's according to McKinsey. And they think it may happen as soon as 20 years earlier than that. So to me, that is a combination of tremendously exciting and a very uncertain future for 50% of our communities. But technology doesn't need necessarily to displace people the way, for example, it's doing in New York in McDonald's and things like that, where the increase in minimum wage shifted McDonald's focus to automating their stores so they didn't need to employ people at all, or very few of them. Technology doesn't have to be a zero sum. It doesn't have to be an us or a them. It can be, as Scott mentioned, an inclusive path forward. And it can be a way for us to make good on the promises that trickle-down economics never did. It just requires us collectively to be mindful about how we deploy it, be mindful about how we create these innovation districts, and to participate in that process. I think every single one of these technologies, these new innovations, this new ecosystem is going to have legal, government, and social implications. And if not us, right here in Northern Virginia, where there are 3 layers of government, where there is more tech than there is density-wise than any other place in the country, who better than us to be leading that charge? Who better than us to be figuring out the inclusive, mindful way to deploy an innovation district for the benefit of all? So I will leave you with this. The Innovation Fund is amazing, and if you believe in this work, which is what we're engaged in right now, then I encourage you to donate. I encourage you to seek us out afterwards if you have a networking or an institution asset that could support the Innovation Coalition. And if this is just an interesting topic to you, then send us your best wishes, because it's a wild ride so far and we're just at the beginning. So thank you very much.
If you look at the numbers, this region is astounding in terms of the number of tech occupations, industries. Actually, venture capital is not that bad from what you would expect. But as you indicated, Rachel, you talked about, it really is 3 layers down inside some of these large companies that are selling to the federal government. It's largely around cybersecurity, other areas, and entrepreneurship is absolutely critical here, and it's just not happening in this region. I'm going to make this up, but I bet you it's reasonably true that if you took the number of tech workers as the numerator and then entrepreneurs as the denominator, the difference between those two in this area would probably be higher than any other community in the country. And so I think but there are things that you can do to fix that. So one, creating programs with partnering with larger companies, trying to get young workers to realize that there are opportunities to either build their own companies or move into the community, and then develop other programs with the local universities, I think is another thing that other communities have done.
Yeah.
But why is entrepreneurship not happening here? What's the cause of that?
So I think Rachel's right in that it is a cultural issue around a lot of the companies that sell to the federal government, generally in the procurement systems that the federal government follows, the legacy of a lot of these companies. They're usually very, very large. I mean, this is just the way that this industry functions.
Yeah.
It's very stovepipe and not entrepreneurial.
There's a couple of issues, I think, in it that we can tackle. I think some of our largest technology companies locally, think of the Northrop Grummans, there's a tremendous amount of IP sitting on shelves in institutions like that having not sold to the government or to the military, perhaps, are sitting there gathering dust. And I think the commercialization of some of that could account for some of the IPs and stuff like that that's not actually, they don't need patents for them at this point. I also think that for us to foster more entrepreneurs, that there's an ecosystem that needs to happen there. There needs to be cash, there needs to be a way forward. There needs to be a density, there needs to be the bumping into people. It's like starting a gig is really hard work. And when we're flush with high-paying jobs for technologists that don't involve that level of risk, that I think it's a tough sell for some people, unless, like Scott said, we get the program started young. I spend some time with George Mason University students, and their entrepreneurship students head in to Refraction, and we talk to them every semester about cultural change and building companies. And invariably when we ask them, oh, so what are you going to do like when you graduate, they tell me they're going into government contracting. So by the time we get to the college entrepreneurship classes, it's already too late. And I think that perhaps the high school and maybe even earlier than that are starting to change the culture of the region where we become builders as opposed to worker bees, perhaps. I think that might have something to do with it. And we've got the Maker Fair coming up in not too long, where we're encouraging little people to like be the master of their own destiny and build something that moves and works and does something. And I think some of those programs, as benign as they may feel, of kind of Lego and robotics, might actually have a significant impact down the track.
I just want to add one thing as well, that there's more good here than bad in that workforce is king, right? And you guys have the workforce, and that is completely non-trivial. And having big companies is an important part of this mixture. Small companies as well, which is, we've been discussing difficulty here, but you cannot undersell the asset of having the workforce in this region, which does exist. That's probably the #1 concern in any of the cities that we work in is, seeing these innovation districts, they are adjacent to some of the lowest income communities in this country. I mean, it is astounding. If you go to West Philly, you're literally, Wharton Business School is a stone's throw from probably the Mantua district, which is one of the, I think, top 20 poorest neighborhoods in the country. So this is a concern everywhere. And I do think that there are things that can be done about this. One, you need to be purposeful about it, right? Like, you can build an innovation economy that only works for 5% of your workforce. And if that's what you want, then so be it. But there are ways, I think, one, connecting employment opportunities amongst large anchors and being purposeful about it, so training programs. You'd be amazed at, even in the larger companies in this region, how hard they have to fill jobs that could be filled with people without a 4-year degree. So one of the things that we're doing in Pittsburgh, working with PNC and some other large companies, is to try to see if they can take the job requirements they have and no longer require, say, a 4-year degree for jobs that frankly don't demand it, right? So there are things that you can do working with your corporate partners and other anchors to create a broader opportunity in the region.
Yeah, I agree. I think it's intentionality. I think our community colleges and things like that are incredibly important parts moving forward. And there are also some programs that can combine credits from online courses with universities with community college courses and generate degrees and things like that with different routes through. I think we can combine those with mindful practices between the innovation ecosystem and the schools themselves. But I think if we build the innovation district first, per se, kind of working for the top of the top, and then try to loop it in afterwards, I think that's a recipe for disaster. So I agree, it's a concern, and I know, at least in the coalition, we have a number of people from Fairfax County who probably the most frequent word they use is equity. We also have Eileen as well, so anything we do has a lens of how do we loop in every level, because for the ecosystem to be as impactful as it can be, then the more voices and the more inclusive it is, the better. And for innovation, by the way, the more inclusive the system is, the more innovation is going to flourish.
Just one very, very quick follow-on to that. So in software development, for most software occupations, if you look at what employers are actually demanding, almost no one needs a computer science degree for this. I mean, that's a bit of an overstatement, but really these are things that students and young people can learn in 6 to 8 months of a training program. So developing, and these are happening all over the country, so convincing people and employers that those credentials are sufficient can really move the needle.
And a bunch of our startups hire for fit over a 4-year degree. It's, do you have the skills and the cultural leaning in order to make it work, as opposed to a degree as a starter.
Kathy.
Thank you so much.
You're close, we can hear you.
Okay, good. I want to understand a little bit about what you're talking about in terms of what the anchor institutions and the creation of the network and the idea of culture shift point to. But what is the actual definition of what innovation brings? Is it bringing more jobs? Are there measures in some of the communities that you've worked in or that you've profiled that we can actually, get our teeth into, that this will be the actual impact that would be a result of this kind of investment And then how long does it take from sort of investment to some tangible results?
Did everyone hear that question? So Kathy Jankowski just asked the panel, how do you define what innovation brings, and how long does it take between investment and when you finally start seeing the fruits of that investment?
Yeah, and so from our perspective, we aren't interested in technology and generation for technology's sake. I'm not a scientist. We're economic development folks. So we are interested in the brass tacks of economic development. So that's jobs, that's tax revenue, I think is often neglected when you look at a lot of these places, and if you backtrack 5 or 10 years when they started incubators and accelerators and other things for young companies, now you see that these companies have grown. They're major revenue generators for the region. So I think so growth in general, I think, is a good thing, obviously. And there is metrics of success here, usually around young companies. In terms of your question about how long it takes, it's a fair question. I don't know the answer. I think you can see quicker wins. These are things, training programs that can often get kick-started fairly quickly, entrepreneurship programs, but then again, you're just starting these companies. The question then becomes, do they grow and produce jobs? And that's usually a longer time frame. So I would say in programs that we think were probably pretty solid home runs, this is probably a decade-long strategy, would be mine.
We talk about it collectively as a 10 to 15 year plan. And we ask the very same question, like, how do we measure this? What are we aiming for? And what we found to begin with is we didn't really have the data of where we're at. So last year we got together some stakeholders, and Adam Zuckerman of Fosterly worked with a number of local counties and colleges to create what was the first startup census, to give us an idea of who we're dealing with and what their needs are and what they're working towards. And it looks as though we're discussing early stages of how do we turn this into an audit or a benchmark or a set of levers that we can measure to give us not just that benchmark, but for us to measure our success year on year. I know Brookings is working on an audit themselves. We're waiting with bated breath, but looking at those drivers hyper-local, not just the broad drivers, but what drives change here and what drives the results we want here, and creating a dashboard for that is something that we're deeply interested in. Berlin actually has, I believe, 3 innovation districts in a size that's not that different to ours. So we don't quite know how to make it work beautifully yet, but there are models around the world of innovation districts that kind of are not too far apart, that can bounce off one another but still be districts in and of their own right, but also support each other and create something that's bigger than the sum of their parts. And there is another location in Northern Virginia at the very least that we know would make a great place. Aside from Reston, Arlington has the bones of an amazing innovation district. Baltimore's already doing amazing things, and obviously Washington, D.C., the district itself, already has some areas that are doing some great things. So our view when we sat down at the table with the intention of it always to be a regional effort was never for it to be Reston as an innovation district. For 2 reasons. One, that doesn't support the region. That's kind of a very selfish way to move forward. And 2, anything that kind of a rising tide lifts all boats. So having the entire region benefits everybody, but also benefits the individual districts within it. So to your question, yes, there are models. We have looked at them, and it doesn't need to be discrete. And also, and I'm sure Scott could speak to this more eloquently than I can, any district does benefit the regions around it, and the space around it. It doesn't need to be kind of a zero-sum game.
So, just to add a little bit, so I think there are 2 geographies that are worth considering when you think about innovation districts. And this type of economic development. One is hyperlocal, in that there needs to be a a physical location, a place where things are happening. All the research points to that density is king. So that's the first area that probably would be somewhat, local. But the second element is a metropolitan area, because these are what labor markets are. So the region really is a critical component of an innovation district, simply because that's where the way we define metropolitan areas is the labor shed, where people will travel for work. And so in that regard, to the extent you're interested in workforce development, finding talent and those types of things, it has to be a metropolitan strategy as a whole. And we see that in every city we work at. We basically work on two levels. We work at the neighborhood, where we see our innovation districts physically being located, and then at the metropolitan level. Those, I don't really think about cities like in terms of a unit, because from an economic perspective, I'm not sure what that is. It's a political boundary. It's not an economic boundary. Metropolitan areas are economic boundaries.
I think a comment was raised a couple of weeks ago that even our art curators of the future are going to need to know tech. There's going to be virtual realities and VR glasses and things like that in our museums, if there aren't already. Even our carpenters, when they remodel our kitchens, are going to pop a VR headset on us so that we can walk through virtually the kitchen and just notice that that bench is actually a little bit too close to the wall. So I think it's a combination of both, as opposed to an either-or. Yes, these trades are never going away, and the more that ecosystems flourish, the more we need them anyhow. And in the future, they're probably going to integrate technology, if not just giving you a quote on an iPad, to using VR to show you the finished remodel of your kitchen before they even pick up a hammer. So yeah, I agree. I think it can cover everything.
If I could just interrupt the program for 1 second. The facilities management here just asked me to announce that there's a blue Toyota Corolla, license plate WXR7214, Virginia, that needs to be moved. Apparently there's a problem. So if it's your car, please move it. And Scott, did you want to comment?
Yeah, I take a slightly different spin on that, in that I think one of the things that frustrates me in a lot of cities that we work is that entrepreneurship programs will be too isolated. They'll be focused on one particular sector, and for sometimes good reasons, because these are growth sectors in a particular place. But the last thing you want to do is limit your deal flow in terms of the amount of just opportunities for entrepreneurship is totally shots on goal. You have no idea what the success rate will be. And from my perspective, if you have somebody who starts a business and it's a sandwich shop, and now they have 37 sandwich shops, 5-10 years down the road, great. I mean, I don't care, right? So I think I totally agree with you in that, and I would also broaden that programs that are focused on entrepreneurship, workforce development, all these things, you really want to take as wide a lens as possible, and narrowing it to just people who are doing an app or something silly. I don't know why you would do that necessarily.
I actually had a really interesting conversation with Sean Mallon of George Mason University not so long ago when I was walking with him across campus, and he was giving me some of the stats about the students at George Mason, and the backgrounds of the students, both socioeconomically. You're talking about their histories. You're talking about the percentage of the student body in George Mason that are the first generation ever to go to college. And we're talking to them, both young men and women, about entrepreneurship, which is a really risky gig. And for a lot of them, their aspirations were not Twitter and Google. They were not a tech startup. They were to be the first of their family to graduate and get a good paying job. And I think that in some ways works against that very instinct of us to be inclusive, where we take our very privileged, often white bread lens, and we impose it upon perhaps histories that we don't deeply understand, and we assume that throwing a $10,000 grant while someone's at college is going to help them start a company, and we ignore the fact that perhaps they're very aware that they're going to be supporting brothers and sisters, or when their ailing parents start to get older, that they'll need to be working with that, and that what they're really focused on is a firm financial founding so that they can kind of continue that increasing legacy in their family. And I think that whilst we're looking at inclusivity, opportunity is not the same as inclusivity. Just making sure opportunity is extended to everybody doesn't change our capacity to take advantage of that opportunity, and it also assumes that we all have the same hierarchy of needs, and that we're all going to approach things the same way that the rich white kids who watch their dads open companies do when they go to college and they get a grant. So I think you're right. I think the conversation is richer and needs to be deeper when we're starting to look at the makeup of our ecosystem.
Entrepreneurship is about lowering risk, right? I mean, that's how you get higher startup numbers, is you reduce the risk of creating a business, right? And there's lots of evidence that shows people who start young companies out of survival because they can't find jobs and other things tend not to be successful businesses, right? So the first step on the ladder is making sure people have the opportunity to take those risks and they're not debilitating risks. People talk about San Francisco, about the risk-taking culture there. I actually don't think it's that risk-taking culture, because you're allowed to fail very easily. And I don't just mean because people won't get mad at you for failure, or because actually there's a safety net there. And I don't just mean in traditional senses, but there's a system in place for people to start businesses and fail and still, put food on the table, right? So I think we shouldn't forget that the first thing to do to build entrepreneurship is to make sure that there's a playing field such that people can take those risks.
Yes. Here comes a microphone.
Quick question. Of the models around the country that you're seeing, how many of them use artists, arts and culture as part of their planning, their package? I mean, not just the play of live, work, play, but I mean, artist live, work spaces, that entrepreneurial, creative element.
I'd say 2/3.
2/3.
I mean, because the reality, I mean, the major push in all of this is the attraction of talent, young talent that want something different, and arts is a huge mechanism for that. I'm trying to think of cities. So they're definitely doing this in Pittsburgh. They're doing this in Oklahoma City now. Across the country, not everyone, I'd say the vast majority, particularly those that aren't relying on a major either academic medical center or research university, definitely use arts as sort of a lever.
2/3 is higher than I would have thought. So
I mean,
it's great.
Yeah, and directionally, right? Like more than half, less than 75%. One thing that I think, so two things that I think are actually reasonably easy and not enough places doing. One, figure out who your peers are and know who you're competing with nationally. So who are the other regions around the country that are really your competitors, and what are they doing? I mean, that in and of itself, I mean, with this group could fairly easy figure out the 5 to 7 places that, if a company was going to go to, then it's the type of company you want here. Where else would they be looking? So one, what are other regions doing that you should be doing? And then the second, I think, is creating a really strong story and actually advertising this. One of the disadvantages of this region is it's just seen as Washington, D.C. and the federal government, which isn't true. And, I mean, I guarantee people in the Bay Area don't know the number of tech workers that exist in Washington, D.C. I mean, that should just be out there. That should be a story that's out there. There should be some sort of organization, some sort of group that is getting that story out there. Somebody waking up every day thinking about how I tell Northern Virginia's story to not just domestic but international markets. Those would be the two things I would do like tomorrow.
Listen, Scott and Rachel, I can't thank you enough for a really, really interesting conversation about innovation districts. And thank you all for coming. I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did, and we'll see you the next time.